Disgraced Scalp-Lock. Among the flat boatmen, there were none that gained the notoriety of Mike Fink. His name is still remembered among the whole of the Ohio as a man who excelled his fellows in everything, particularly in his rifle shot, which was acknowledged to be unsurpassed. Probably no man ever lived who could compete with Mike Fink in the latter's accomplishment. Strong as Hercules, free from all nervous excitement, and possessed of perfect health, and familiar with his weapon from childhood, he raised the rifle to his eye, and having once taken sight, it was firmly fixed as if buried in rock. It was Mike's pride, and he rejoiced on all occasions where he could bring it into use, whether it was turned against a beast of prey or the more savage Indian. In his day, these last named were the common foe with whom Mike Fink and his associates had to contend. On the occasion that we would particularly introduce Mike to the reader, he had bound himself for a while to the pursuits of the trade, until a voyage into the headwaters of Ohio, down the Mississippi, could be completed. Heretofore, he had kept himself exclusively to the Ohio, but a liberal reward and some curiosity prompted him to extend his business character beyond his ordinary habits and inclinations. In accomplishment of his object, he was lolling carelessly over the big sweep that guided the flats on which he was officiated. The current of the river bore the boat swiftly along and made his labor light. His eye glanced about him, and he broke forth in ecstasies at what he saw and felt. If there was a river in the world that merits the name of beautiful, it is the Ohio, when its channel is, without overflowing, full. The scenery is everywhere soft. There are no jutting rocks, no steep banks, no high hills, but the clear and swift current leaves beautiful and undulating shores that descend gradually to the water's edge. The foliage is rich and luxuriant, and its outlines in the water are no less distinct than when it is relieved against the sky. Interspersed along its route are islands, as beautiful as ever figured in poetry as the land of the fairies, enchanted spots indeed, that seem to sit so lightly on the water that you almost expect them, as you approach, to vanish into dreams. So late as when Mike Fink disturbed the solitude of the Ohio with his rifle, the canoe of the Indian was hidden in the little recesses along the shore. They moved about in their frail barks like spirits, and clung, in spite of the constant encroachments of civilization, to places which tradition has designated as happy places of a favored people. Wild and uncultivated as Mike appeared, he loved nature, and had a soul that sometimes felt, while admitting it, an exalted enthusiasm. The Ohio was his favorite stream. From where it runs no stronger than a gentle rivulet to where it mixes with the muddy Mississippi, Mike was as familiar with its meanderings as a child would be with those of a flower garden. He could not help noticing with sorrow the desecrating hand of improvement as he passed along, and half soliloquizing, and half addressing his companions, he broke forth. "I knew these parts before a squatter's axe had blazed a tree. 'Twas then pulled a sweep to a living, but pulling the triggers of business, those were times to see. A man might call himself lucky. What's the use of improvements? When did cutting down a tree make deer more plenty? Who ever found a wild buffalo or brave Indian in a city? Where's the fun, the frolicking, the fighting? Gone, gone. The rifle won't make a man a living now. He must turn nigger and work. If force continue to be used up, I may yet be smothered in settlements. Boys, this there life won't do. I'll stick to the broadhorn according to contract. Once done with it, I'm off for a frolic. Choctaws or Cherokees on the Mississippi don't give a brush as we pass along. I shall grow as poor as a starved wolf in a pitfall. I must, to live peacefully, point my rifle at something more dangerous than varmints. 6 months and no fight would spill me like more than a dead horse on a prairie." Mike ceased speaking. Then the beautiful village of Louisville appeared in sight. The labor of landing the boat occupied his attention. The bustle and confusion that followed such an incident ensued, and Mike was his own master by the law until the employer ceased trafficking, and again required his services. At the time we write of, there were a great many renegade Indians who lived about the settlements, and which were encased were the extreme southwest. The Indians generally are the most degraded of their tribe, outcasts, who, for the crime of dissipation, are no longer allowed to associate with their people. They live by hunting or stealing, and spend their precarious gains in intoxication. Among the throng that crowded on the flatboat on his arrival were a number of these unfortunate beings. They were influenced by no other motive than that of loading around the idle speculation of what was going on. Mike was attracted towards him at sight, as he too was in the situation that seemed most favorable for mischief. It struck him that it was a good opportunity to have a little sport at the Indians' expense. Without ceremony, he gave a terrific war whoop, then mixing the language of the Aborigines with his own together, he went on in savage fashion and bragged about his triumph and victories on the warpath, with all seemed earnestness of a real brave. Nor were the taunting words spared to exasperate the poor creatures, who, perfectly helpless, listened to the tales of their own greatness, and their own shame, until it wound up to the highest pitch of impotent exasperation. Mike's companions joined in. The thoughtless boys caught the spirit of the affair, and the Indians were goaded until they, in turn, made battle with their tongues. Then commenced a system of running against it, piling off their blankets, together with 1,000 other indignities. Finally, they made a precipitate retreat ashore, amid the hooting and jeering of an unfeeling crowd, who considered them poor devils destitute of feeling and humanity. Among this crowd of outcasts were a Cherokee, who wore the name of Proud Joe. What his real cognomen was, no one knew, for he was taciturn and haughty, and in spite of his poverty and his manner of life, won the name we have mentioned. His face was expressive of talent, but it was furrowed by the man's most terrible habits of drunkenness. That he was a superior Indian was admitted, and it was also understood that he was banished from his mountain home, his tribe being numerous and powerful for some great crime. He always looked up to his companions, and managed, however, intoxicated he might be, to sustain a singular proud bearing, which did not even depart him from while prostrating on the ground. Joe was filthy in his person and habits. In this respect he was behind his fellows. But one ornament of his person was attended to with care which might have done honor to him if surrounded by his people and in his native woods. Joe still wore the Indian dignity of the Scalp-Lock. He ornamented it with taste, and cherished it, as the report said. Some Indians, the messenger of vigilance, might tear it from his head, as expiatory of his numerous crimes. Mike noted this peculiarity, and reached out his hand, plucked it from the hawk's feather, which was attached from the Scalp-Lock. The Indian glared horribly at Mike in his consummate as an insult, and snatched the feather from his hand. Then, shaking his clenched fist in the air as if calling on heaven for revenge, retreated with his friends. Mike saw that he had roused his savage's soul, and marveled wonderfully at the resentment should be exhibited, and as earnest to Proud Joe the wrong he had done him should not rest unavenged. He swore that he would cut the Scalp-Lock off close to his head, first convenient opportunity he got. Then he thought no more about it. The following morning, the arrival of the boat at Louisville had occupied making preparations to pursue the voyage downriver. Nearly everything had been completed, and Mike had taken his favorite place at the sweep. When looking up the river bank, he beheld at some distance Joe and his companions, and perceived from their gesticulations that they were making him the subject of their conversation. Mike thought instantly of several ways in which he could show them altogether the fair fight, and then whip them in ease. He also reflected that with extreme satisfaction he would enter into the spirit of the argument, and other matters to join him pleasing, when all the Indians disappeared, save Joe himself, who stood at times reviewing him in moody silence, and then starting round the passing objects, from the peculiarity of Joe's position to Mike, with who was below him. The head and upper part of his body relieved boldly against the sky, and in one of his movements he brought his profile face to view. The prominent Scalp-Lock and its adornments seemed to be more striking than ever, and it again roused the pugnancy of Mike Fink. In an instant he raised his rifle, always loaded and at command, and brought it to his eye. Before he could be prevented, drew sight upon proud Joe, and fired. The ball whistled loud and shrill, and Joe, springing his whole length into the air, fell upon the ground. The cold-blooded murder was noticed by 50 persons at least. There arose from the crowd a universal cry of horror and indignation of the bloody deed. Mike himself seemed to be much astonished, and in an instant reloaded his rifle, as a number of white persons rushed towards the boat. Mike threw aside his coat, and taking his powder horn between his teeth, leaped, rifle in hand, into the Ohio, and commenced swimming for the opposite shore. Some bold spirits determined Mike should not so easily escape, and jumped into the only skiff at command and pulled safely after him. Mike watched their movements until they came within a few hundred yards of him, and turning into the water, he supported himself by his feet alone, and raised his deadly rifle to his eye. Its muzzle, if it spoke hostilely, was as certain to send a messenger of death through one or more of their pursuers, as if it were lightning, and they knew it. Dropping their oars and turning pale, they begged Mike not to fire. Mike waved his hand toward the little village of Louisville, and again pursued his way to the opposite shore. The time consumed by the firing of Mike's rifle, the pursuit and the abandonment of it, required less than the time we have taken to give the details. In that time, to the astonishment of the gaping crowd around Joe, they saw him rising with a bewildered air. A moment more, and he recovered his senses and stood up. At his feet lay his scalp-lock. The ball had cut it clear from his head. The cord around the root of it, in which were placed feathers and other ornaments, held it together. The concussion had merely stunned its owner. Farther, he had escaped any bodily harm. A cry of exultation rose from the last evidence of the skill of Mike Fink. The exhibition of the shot that established his claim, indisputable to the eminence he ever afterwards held, the unrivaled marksman of all the float boatmen in the western waters. Proud Joe had received many insults. He looked upon himself as degraded, worthless being, and the ignominy heaped over him he never, except by relay, resented. But the last insult was like seizing a lion by the mane, or a Roman senator by the beard. It roused the slumbering demon within, and made him again thirst to resent his wrongs with an intensity of emotion that could only be felt by an Indian. His eye glared upon the jeering crowd around him like a fiend. His chest swelled and heaved until he seemed he must suffocate. No one noticed this emotion. All were intent on the exploit that had so singularly deprived Joe of his warlock, and smothered in his wrath, he retreated to his associates with consuming fire in his vitals. He was a different man from an hour before, and with that desperate resolution of which a man stakes his all, he swore by the Great Spirit and his forefathers that he would be revenged. An hour after the disappearance of Joe, both he and Mike Fink were forgotten. The flatboat, which had later deserted, had got under the way, and dashing through the rapids in the river opposite to Louisville, went its course. As is customary when night sets in, the boat was securely fastened in some little bend or bay to the shore, where it remained until early morning. Long before the sun had fairly risen, the boat was again pushed into the stream, and it passed through the valley, presenting the greatest possible beauty and freshness of landscape that man can conceive. It was spring, and 1,000 tints of green developed themselves in the half-formed foliage and bursting buds. The beautiful mallard skimmed across the water, ignorant of the danger of the white man's approach. A splendid spoonbill decked the shallow places near the shore, while myriads of singing birds filled the air with their unwritten songs. In the far reaches down the river, there occasionally might be seen a bear stepping around the ground as if daintily at his feet, and snuffing intruder of its wild home, would retreat into the woods. To enliven all this and give a picture of the look of humanity, there might also be seen, struggling with the floating mists, a column of blue smoke that came from the fire built from a projecting point of land, around which the current swept rapidly and carried everything that floated on the river. The eye of the boatman saw the advantage of the situation, where the place rendered to those on shore to annoy and attack as wandering Indians. In those days, did not hesitate to rob. There is much of speculation as to what reception the boat would receive from the builders of the fire. The rifles were loaded, to be prepared for the worst, and the loss of Mike's lamented as a prospect of fight presented itself, where he used his terrible rifle. The boat, in the meantime, swept around the point, but an instant of the enemy there lay, in the profound sleep, Mike Fink with his feet toasting at the fire. His pillow was a huge bear that had been shot on the previous day, and while his sides, spattered in profusion around him, were several deer and wild turkeys. Mike had not been idle. After picking out a place most eligible to notice a passing boat, he had spent his time in hunting, and he was surrounded by trophies of his prowess. The scene that he presented was worthy of the time of man, and would have thrown Landseer into a delirium of joy, could he have witnessed it. The boat, owing to the swiftness of the river, passed Mike's resting place, although it was pulled strongly to shore. As Mike's companions came opposite him, he raised up such a shout of self-exaltation in meeting him, and half to alarm him with the idea that Joe's friends were upon him. Mike, at the sound, sprang to his feet, rifle in hand, as he looked around and raised it to his eye, and by the time he discovered the boat, he was ready to fire. "Down your shooting iron, you wild critter!" shouted one of the boatmen. Then Mike dropped his piece and also gave a loud halloo that echoed among the solitudes of the peaceful artillery. The meeting between Mike and his fellows was characteristic. They had joked and jibed with each other with a rough wit, and parried it off with the most credible ingenuity. Mike soon learned the extent of the rifle shot, and seemed perfectly indifferent to the fact that proud Joe was not dead. The only sentiment he uttered was regret that he did not fire the vagabond's head, and if he hadn't hit it, he would have made the first bad shot in 20 years. The dead game was carried on board the boat. The adventure was forgotten, and everything resumed in the monotony of floating on a flat boat down the Ohio. A month or more elapsed, and Mike had progressed several hundred miles on the Mississippi. His journey had been remarkably free from incident. Morning, noon, and night presented the same banks, the same muddy water, and he sighed to see some broken land, some high hills, and he railed and swore that he had been such a fool to desert his favorite Ohio for the river that produced nothing but alligators and was never the best half finished. Occasionally, the plentiness of game put him in spirits, and it did not last long. He wanted more lasting excitement. He declared himself perfectly miserable and helpless as a wildcat without teeth or claws. In the vicinity of Natchez rises a few abrupt hills, which tower above the surrounding lowlands of the Mississippi like mountains. They are not high, but iron from their loneliness and rarity, they create sensations of pleasure and awe. Under the shadow of one of these bluffs, Mike and his associates made the customary preparations to pass the night. Mike's enthusiasm knew bounds at the sight of land again. He said it was pleasant as cold water to a fresh wound, and as his spirits rose, he went on making his region round about, according to his notions, an agreeable residence. "The Choctaws live in these diggings," said Mike. "The cursed time they must have of it. Now, if I lived in these parts, I'd declare war on 'em, just to have something to keep me from growing dull. Without some such business, I'd be as musty as an old swamp musk. I could build a cabin on their hill that could, from its location, with my rifle, repulse a whole tribe if they came after me. What a beautiful time I'd have of it. I never was particular about what they called a fair fight. I just asked half chance and the odds against me. And if I didn't keep clear of the swags and sailors, they'd let me spring a leak and go to the bottom. It's nature that the big fish should eat the little ones. I've seen a trout swallow a perch, and a cat come along and swallow the trout. Perhaps on the Mississippi, the alligators could use the cat, and so on to the end of the road. Well, I'll walk into varmints and Indians. I've had my way, God. When it comes to nature, it'll just grin into a hyena. I'm a regular tornado, tough as hickory and long-winded as a nor'wester. I can strike a blow like a fallen tree. Every lick takes a gap in the crowd that lets in an acre of sunshine. "Ooh, boys," shouted Mike, twirling his rifle like a walking stick around his head, but the idea is suggested in his mind. "Ooh, boys, if a Choctaw devil was in them woods or give me a brush, just as I feel now, I'd call them gentlemen. I must fight something, or I'll catch a dry rot. Burnt brandy won't save me." Such were some of the expressions which Mike gave utterance to, and in which his companions hardly joined. They never presumed to be quite equal to Mike, for his bodily prowess, as well as his rifle, were acknowledged to be unsurpassed. These displays of animal spirits generally ended in boxing and wrestling matches, in which falls were received and blows were struck without being noticed. That would have destroyed common men. Occasionally, angry words and blows were exchanged, but like the summer storm, the cloud that emitted the lightning purified the air. When the commotion ceased, the combatants immediately made friends and became more attached to each other than before because of the interrupted good feelings occurred. Such were the conversations and amusements of the evening when the boat was moored under the bluffs we have alluded to. As night wore on, one by one the hardy boatmen fell asleep, some on its confined interior, and others protected by a light covering in the open air. The moon arose with magnificent beauty. The silver light behind the highlands gave her the power of theatrical effect as it ascended. And as its silver rays grew perpendicular, they finally kissed gently the summit of the hills and poured down in their full light upon the boat with almost noonday brilliancy. The silence in which the beautiful changes of darkness and light were produced made me mysterious. It seemed as if the creative power was at work, bringing form of life out of darkness. In the midst of this witchery and this quiet scene, there sounded forth a terrible rifle and the more terrible war whoop of the Indians. One of the flatboatmen, asleep on deck, gave a stifled groan, turned upon his face, and with a quivering notion, ceased to live. Not so with his companions. There in an instant the men accustomed to danger and sudden attacks sprang ready armed to their feet. But before they could discover their foes, 7 sleek and horribly painted savages leapt from the hills into the boat, and firing of the rifle was useless, and each man singled out a foe and met him with a drawn knife. The struggle was quick and fearful, and deadly blows were given amid the screams and imprecations that rent the air. But the voice of Mike Fink could be heard in encouraging shouts above the clamor. "Give it to them, boys!" he cried. "Cut their hearts out! Choke the dogs! Here's hell, a fire and a ring rising!" Then, clinching with the most powerful of the assailants, he rolled with him upon the deck of the boat. Powerful as Mike was, the Indians seemed nearly to match for him. 2 twisted and writhed like serpents, now one seeming to have the advantage, then the other. In all this confusion, there might occasionally be seen glancing in the moonlight a blade of a knife, but at whom the thrusts were made or who wielded it could not be discovered. The general fight lasted less time than we have taken to describe it. White men gained the advantage. 2 of the Indians lay dead upon the boat, and the living, escaping from their antagonists, lay shore before the rifle could be brought to bear. They were out of its reach. While Mike was yet struggling with one antagonist, and his companions cut the boat loose from the shore, and with powerful exertion managed to get its bows far from the current, that it flung around and floated. But before this was accomplished, and before anyone interfered with Mike, he was on his feet, covered with blood, blowing like a porpoise by the time he could get his breath. He commenced talking. "Ain't been so busy for a long time," he said, turning over his victim with his foot. "That fellow out beautiful. If he's a specimen of Choctaws that live in these parts, they are screamers, infernal serpents, and dead possums." Taking in his way, he with the others took a general survey of the killed and wounded. Mike himself was a good deal cut up from the Indian's knife, but he called the wounds blackberry scratches. One of Mike's associates was severely hurt. The rest escaped comparatively harmless. The sacrifice was made at the first fire, for beside the dead Indians there lay one of the boat's crew, cold and dead, his body perforated with 4 different balls. That he was the chief object of the attack seemed evident, yet no one of his associates knew of his having a single fight with the Indians. The soul of Mike was affected. Taking the hand of his deceased friend between his own, he raised his bloody knife towards the night moon and swore that he would desolate the nation that claimed the Indians who made war upon them that night, and turned to his stiffened victim, that, dead as he was, retained the expression of implacable hatred and defiance. It gave him a smile of grim satisfaction, then joined the general conversation which the occurrences of the night would naturally suggest. The master of the Broadhorn was a businessman, and had often been down the Mississippi. This was the first attack he had received, or knew had to have been made from the shores inhabited by the Cherokee, by the Choctaws, except by the white man, and he, among other things, suggested keeping the dead Indians until daylight, that they might have an opportunity to examine their dress and features, and see what certainty were to blame for the occurrence of the night. The dead boatman was removed with care to a respectful distance, and the living, except the person that swept the boat, were soon buried in a profound slumber. Not until the rude breakfast was partaken, and the funeral rites of the dead boatman were solemnly performed, did Mike and his companions disturb the corpses of the red men. Both of these things had been leisurely and gently got through with. There was a different spirit among the men. Mike was disturbed, and went about his business with alacrity. He stripped the bloody blanket from the Indian he had killed, as if enveloped in something disgusting and required no respect. He examined carefully the moccasins at the Indian's feet, pronouncing them at one time Chickasaws, another time the Shawnee. He stared at the livid face, but he could not recognize the style of paint that covered it. That the Indians were not strictly national in their adornments was certain, for they examined practiced eyes, and they could be told the nation of the dead, if such a thing had been the case, as readily as a sailor could distinguish a ship by its flag. Mike was evidently puzzled, and was about to give up his task as hopeless, and the dead body was examining. For some cause he turned on its side. Mike's eyes distended, and some of his companions observed, like a choked cat. He became riveted. He drew himself up in a half-serious, half-comic expression, pointing at the back of the dead Indian's head, where he exhibited the dead warrior in its paints, destitute of his scalp-lock, a small stump of which was only left, being stiffened with red paint. Those that could read Indian symbols learned the volume of deadly resolve in what they saw. The body of Proud Joe was stiff and cold before them. The last and best shot of Mike Fink cost the brave man his life. The corpse was so lately interred, was evidently taken in the moonlight by Proud Joe and his party, as that of Mike's, and they risked their lives, one and all, that he might certainly be sacrificed. Nearly 1,000 miles of swamp had been threaded. Large and swift-running rivers had been crossed. Also tribes passed through by Joe and his friends, that they might revenge his fearful insult, and destroying without the life the sacred Scalp-Lock.